We're going to finish up basically 1 Samuel this week. Okay? So we're skipping chapters 27, 28, and 29, which
Where you at?
we're going to end up in chapter 30.
What?
1 Samuel.
30 verse 6. Even starting on.
Well, we'll start at verse 1, but I think we need to touch bases real quick, that David being run around, being chased by Saul, and we know that they kind of reconciled in our story last week, but David did not return with Saul because he didn't trust him. Well, the very next verse in 27, he says, I will perish one day by the hand of Saul, right? And there may be a time lapse at that spot, okay?
Let me turn that down one notch.
Turn it down to 1. Here, I'll get it. Okay,
I can
so
hear nothing when it's wide open.
right. David goes and lives with the Philistines in order to avoid Saul. We don't have any record in the scripture that David asked God if he should go live with the Philistines.
He just made that up.
He thought, what a safe place.
Yeah.
Right? So he goes down to Goth and hooks up with the king, Achish, right? And he's there like a year and a half. It's quite a while. I mean, David's not an old guy, And along comes another war between the Philistines and the Israelites. But in the middle of this, we have Saul trying to get an answer from God. We already know God's left him, right? So he goes to see this sorcerer and wants to talk to Samuel. Now, on Saul's good side, he had pretty much rid Israel of these types of people because the scripture is definitely telling you that they all should be stoned to death. It's not good practice because in reality, most of the time, it's actually demons that they end up bringing up and creating all kinds of havoc for people. But anyway, he finds one and promises her he's not going to do anything. And so the Lord allows Samuel to speak to Saul. I would call this an exceptional scripture. This is not a normal practice. But Samuel's not going to tell Saul anything different than what he told him before, right? But it's such an unusual happening in Scripture, I thought we ought to at least touch on it, David's with the Philistines, and he's been going out and raiding cities of the Amalekites and others, right? Coming back and then telling the king, Achish, that he's been raiding Judah. So the king thinks that he's his real loyal follower, right? He's completely separated himself from Israel, which is not true, but he has to a degree. He's living with the Philistines, okay? But nonetheless, so he's using David and his 600 men as his personal bodyguard as they go to this battle. Well, the other commanders of the Philistines are like, what the heck is David doing with us, right? Remember this guy, the guy who kills his 10,000s? We don't need him on the battlefield behind us, right? So they convinced the king to send him home. So God has protected David from getting in a war fighting against his own people. Send him back to his hometown, right? Where he's been living the last year and a half and all his people and everything, right? So he is spared from having to fight against Saul, okay? Against the armies of Israel. And we get to chapter 30, and again, we don't have any record that David asked God about going with the Philistines to this battle. So he and his 600 men leave their city defenseless and are going to war in a war that's going to be fighting against his own people. I would guess if he asked God about that, God would have said, "Are you kidding me?" Right? If God could swear, he would have said not only no, but H no. Right? And my opinion anyway, right? In verse 1 of chapter 30, it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag, which is his hometown now, where he's been staying the last year and a half, on the third day. So it's a 3-day march. So they'd been gone 3, and a 3-day march back, okay? That the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. Well, right away, I've got all kinds of questions. Wasn't Saul supposed to go and wipe out all the Amalekites? All.
Supposed to.
We know he brought the king back. Obviously, he didn't come anywhere near wiping out all the Amalekites, did he? And why did God want to wipe out the Amalekites?
They were idol worshippers.
Yes, but they also, when the Israelites are in the desert, they're the ones that would come along behind, right, and murder, the stragglers. Anybody that was weak or falling behind or whatever, they would take advantage of those weaknesses, right? So God had told them back then, that I'm going to clean the slate with you guys. And when it was time that God wanted that done and sent Saul to do it, Saul did not do it. Okay? Now, it's also interesting that they came in, they burned the town, and they didn't kill anybody.
Means it was totally defenseless.
It was completely defenseless, right?
That was interesting.
These are people that are in the habit of killing people, for no good reason. And in this case, God intervened and made sure these people were protected. So David, who failed to communicate with God and failed to defend his family, right, is being protected by God unawares. How often has God done that for us?
Well, we're unaware, so how would it know?
Now David, in verse 3, when David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Okay? Now, of course, the Amalekites, they'd been raided by David's men, where David was killing everybody he found in those villages. And now this is kind of like payback, but they didn't kill the women and the children and the elderly and everybody who couldn't go to war, right? So here we got Amalekites that shouldn't even be there. And they're coming to paying back David for what they think David has done to them, which you would seem would be somewhat fair, right? Now David's 2 wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him.
It was all his fault that they were in that
Yeah.
predicament.
Why were they with the
The leader always gets the blame.
why were they with the Philistines to begin with? Whose decision was it to go down there?
David's.
David.
Whose decision was it to go to war with the Philistines and leave their town,
David.
right? All right. Now, these men of his, they had joined his army knowing that he's the next king. He's anointed king. So what do they think their future is?
Oh, really, really good.
Princes and whatnot. You know, these are going to be top dogs in the new David government, right? Cabinet post and all that kind of stuff, right? Okay? Well, now what's happened? They feel like they have nothing. So they're pretty upset. And at David. Now look at David's point of view. He's been driven out of his home country and from his religion, because where's the temple? Not in Ziklag, right? You know, he's now been rejected by the Philistines even. They sent him back home. You can't fight with us. And he's lost all he has to the Amalekites. And now his own men have turned on him. When is it common for people to finally turn to God?
When the backs are dark. Well,
He got nowhere else to go now, does he? You know, and of course David is one of the giants of our history, Christian history, you know, in Scripture, etc. But don't we act the same way? It's interesting that God puts the faults and the weaknesses of even the heroes in Scripture for us to see. To see that they're people. They make the same kind of mistakes that we make. But,
I love it. I think I mentioned this before, but whenever Gold's Gym was up here in the shopping center, during the daytime, it was Gold's Gym. But at night, the L didn't light up. God's Gym. So whenever, I always thought, when things get dark, that's whenever we want to give it back to God.
Yeah, that's right.
But whenever things are good and bright, then
That's the right
Gold's
symbolism.
the even thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Excuse me. So all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons, his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord, his God. And David had been out of God's will for a while. We read in the future that he's out of God's will for a year. Right?
They were there, what, a year and a half?
Mm-hmm. So he's been out of God's will for at least that long, right? David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. What's the ephod?
I was just getting ready to ask you that.
Well,
Symbol of authority.
I'm not sure exactly, but it's like a vest.
The priests would wear this
Breastplate?
on their chest. And it had these stones,
Oh, okay.
right, representing the different tribes. But it also had the Urim and the Thummim, which is what they used to make decisions. They would ask the priests would in essence roll the dice,
Yeah.
and out comes the answer. They would tell you what God's wanted.
Yeah.
Now nobody knows what the Urim and the Thummim exactly were, right? Some people think it was 2 coins that you flipped, right? You know, if they came up heads and heads, God said yes. If they were tails and tails, God said no. And if they were mixed, God said, I'm not answering you.
If you ever look that up, there's a dozen different definitions for an ephod.
Yeah. So
You don't
it's
know
not
which
something
one
that we
it
can
was.
say emphatically, right, at all. But we know the purpose of it was to get God's answer to your prayer.
Yeah.
And so the priest had to do this. Now, I don't know how far he had to go to get this priest.
You're probably with them.
He's in the land of the Philistines. Now, the Philistines would have probably killed him if he had a Jewish priest there, I'm guessing. So he had to send him to one of the villages. I'm just guessing. We don't know. God didn't choose to tell us. But the point is, he had to take the step, turning to God and asking God. And the way he asked God was to have the priest answer. Right? And David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I pursue this band? And shall I overtake them?" And he said to him, "Pursue, you shall surely overtake them, and you shall surely rescue," how many?
All of them.
Everyone.
Everyone.
Did they think any of them were still alive?
They didn't know.
Probably didn't.
They probably assumed that most of them were dead. And they'd probably find them on the trail chasing down the band, right? Or sold into slavery, right? It's one of the common things to do. Or just make slaves out of them, kind of thing, right? So David went, and he and his 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook of Besor, where those left behind remained. David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor remained behind. So 1/3 of his army is left behind. He only has 400 men now. Remember, they just marched 3 days. And they wept, I don't know how long, where they were completely exhausted. Now they get up and start marching again. Right? Now they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread, and he ate, and they provided him water to drink, and they gave a piece of a fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, and he ate them. Then his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. He wasn't in good shape. And we'll find out here that he wasn't in good shape when they left him, let alone 3 days later, right? Is this an accident that they found this Egyptian?
No.
When God had his hand on
My gosh, God provided him an internal spy, right?
it. Yeah.
Isn't it amazing what God does if you're in his will?
Sometimes we don't realize it until you look back.
Yeah. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" And he said, "I am a young man of Egypt, a servant of an Amalekite, and my master left me behind when I was sick 3 days ago." He was already sick. And the Amalekite's like, "You're worthless to me now." So he just left him to die. Throughout most of history, slaves were considered less valuable than animals. A cow or a bull was more valuable than a human. You could always get another human. Right? We made a raid on the Negev of the Cherethites, and on that which belongs to Judah, and on the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. He's like, "Oh, okay." And David said to him, "Will you bring me down to this band? You gonna show me where they're at?" He said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring you down to this band." Swear by who?
God. You recognize the power of God.
How did he know that? An Egyptian with the Amalekites is asking him to swear by Jehovah.
They probably heard it through the grapevine.
Well, I think a lot of the Egyptians, they knew who the God of Israel was, but just didn't worship him. But they seen the things that he had done.
They'd seen it. The Amalekites had seen it, all the time in the wilderness, and they crossed over, and then they took the promised land and, all the stuff that had gone on in the past. Everybody knew the history, right? And they could recognize that David and his band were Jews, right? And so he said, I want you to swear by your God, the God. Not by my God or Egyptian God or a Amalekite God, right? Swear by your God, right? And when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. So here they are, probably worshiping their false gods, eating, drinking, dancing, right? And notice it says they were spread. They're all spread out. No defenses. Now, why were they so casual? Where was the Philistine army? Up north, fighting the Israeli army. And they thought David was up there too. They just raided Ziklag because he was gone, right? There's nobody around here right now. So they thought. So God caused them to put themselves in a position that made it possible for David's 400 men to wipe out their entire army, with the exception of 400 guys who escaped on camels. I mean, those who escaped were 400 on camels. We don't know how many the total army was, but it must have been in the thousands. Okay? And David slaughtered them from twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who rode on camels. David's men were in no shape to chase down people riding camels, right? So those guys got away, but everybody else, he slaughtered them.
Well, I've never seen a camel run. Have you seen a camel?
Yeah, they're
run?
Yeah,
really quick.
They have camel races.
yeah. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, all, not just what they took from Ziklag, all,
How many? 400?
400.
And would they have had 400 camels?
Yeah, these 400 guys are all on camels. That's what I'm saying. The size of the entire army was pretty substantial.
What do you feed a camel? My God, that'd take an awful lot of stuff just to feed the camels. We don't talk about the army.
About water.
Yeah.
And you don't think of a lot of grass out in the desert, do you?
Or water.
Yeah. David recovered all they had taken and rescued his 2 wives, and nothing of theirs was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that they had taken for themselves. David brought it all back. How weird is that? That's God's provision right there, isn't it?
Had to be.
Yeah. So David had captured all the sheep, the cattle, and the cattle which the people drove ahead of the other livestock, and they said, "This is David's spoil." After all, who's the anointed king?
David,
And thus the spoils of war normally would go to
the king.
the king. Excuse me. When David came to the 200 men who were too exhausted to follow David, who had been left behind at the brook Besor, they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with them. Then David approached the people and greeted them. Right? This is a loving kind of greet, This is, he was glad to see him, encouraged them, right, kind of thing. But then all the wicked and worthless men, not everybody in David's army was top notch, right? Among them who went with David answered and said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except to every man his wife and his children, that they may lead them away and depart. Because they were too exhausted to fight this particular battle. And how many battles had they been in together? Many. Many, right? But this particular battle, so they're saying, you no longer belong to us. Take your wives and your children and get on down the road. That's why it starts out with all the wicked. Excuse me. But then David said, you must not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. These people should share in the spoil too. They're part of us. They're our brothers, right? Because after all, who's responsible for the victory?
God is.
God was, not you. You guys, you're not the reason why we won this battle. God's responsible. God's the reason why we won this battle. God's the reason why we have all our stuff back, right? Plus a whole bunch of extra, right? And some of it came from villages in Judah, right? It said, the Lord has given us, who has kept us and delivered into our hand the band that came against us. And who will listen to you in this matter? You know, this is crazy, right? For as his share is, who goes down to the battle, so shall the share be, to who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. So it has been from that day forward that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. He issued an executive order. This is how it's going to work. Now, when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to his brothers of Judah. Remember, where did some of this stuff come from?
From Judah.
Villages in Judah that the Amalekites had raided, right? To his friends, saying, behold, a gift for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. Enemies of the Lord. To those who were in Bethel. Anybody know what Bethel means? What does the EL on the end stand for?
First part of that's nothing.
The EL is God. This is house of God. The very first place he sent stuff was to the village called the house of God. Right? And to those who were in Ramoth and of the Negev, and to those who were in Jettir, and to those who were in Aorah, and to those who were in Sifmoth, to those who were in, let me pronounce this one, you ready? Estimoa, right? And to those who were in Rakal, and to those who were in the cities of Jerahmeelites, and to those who were in the cities of the Kenites, and to those who were in Hormah, and to those who were in Borashtan, and to those who were in Atak. He must have had a lot of stuff, right? He had plenty to share.
But, it says here, it said to things into the city of the Kenites. Well, those were the descendants of Cain, weren't they?
Yes.
The Kenites. So why was he sending stuff there?
Well, this was a village in Judah, right? All of these are southern villages, right, in the southern part of Judah, that the Amalekites who would come out of the desert and they'd come up and raid in order to get stuff to feed their animals, right? And they go back down, etc. So he was sending it to all these villages were in Judah. So he's And these are villages that he and his men had been to for the most part while he was running from Saul. He's hiding out, going to these places, right? So, like he calls them his brothers, right? So he's taken care of, right? So I put a note down here, that David shared from all the spoil like we should share. Whenever God gives us, we should share, right? Not to mention our tithe, but we should be sharing as much as we possibly can, okay? And not use it for our lust, which is what they were using it for, right? The Amalekites were. But this is also a very wise political move. He completely solidifies his kingship in Judah, right? He goes on to say to those who were in Hebron, what do we know about Hebron? That's David's first capital. He's about to become anointed king in Hebron. And how long is he in Hebron as king? Before he becomes king in all of Israel. Anybody remember? 7 years. 7 years, 6 months to be exact. Right? It says, and to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to go. So even other places than these, he sent stuff. And they'd probably been raided and whatnot and had problems off and on with these Amalekites. And because like the Amalekites, they would always go after those that were the weakest. Like Ziklag when David and his men were gone.
They were like vultures.
Yes. And they were supposed to be gone. God had sent Saul to wipe them out. Right? And he didn't do it.
When I was younger, I used to wonder why. Why would God send his army to go and wipe out all the people in the villages? And then, later on, I figured out, because they didn't worship God, they worshiped all these other idols and did all kinds of wild things,
Yeah, and besides them being enemies of God, and besides the fact that they had done things and been at war with God, right? It's of common opinion that they were carrying a lot of disease, and just the slate needed to be cleaned, which is why he would say, kill every man, woman, and child. Don't bring them into your camp, right? But anyway, this is what God was telling him to do. David goes on to become king, in Hebron, while Saul's son, King Saul dies in this battle. So at the same time this is happening is when Saul and Jonathan are killed. Okay? But his son, Ishabeth, what's his name? Ishbosheth, becomes king in Israel. Abner makes him the king, the son of Saul, right? So for 7.5 years, we've still got this conflict going on. But during that whole time, David's getting stronger and stronger, and Israel with Ishbosheth is getting weaker. And finally, he makes the wrong statement to Abner. And Abner says, all right, I'm done with you. And he goes sees David and says, you need to be king over all Israel. And to make a long story short, he does. All right? Any questions or comments about this lesson, how God provides for us, even when we're stupid?
Well, on the 4th verse of 31 chapters where we see Saul exiting, he falls on his sword and he's dead.
Well, he wasn't dead yet.
Huh?
He wasn't quite dead yet. He dies, but he's not quite dead yet.
Yeah,
We learn in 2 Samuel that this guy comes along and says, and Saul says, finish me off. And so he did. And he took his head to David, saying, look, I killed Saul for you. And David's like, what right have you to lay your hand on the Lord's anointed? And then he kills him. He thought he was going to get a reward. He got his head severed. Anyway, it's interesting how God is always working, right? Even we're unaware of what's happening. And he's got our best interest at heart if we just would let go, allow God. And so if we would just trust God all along and try to stay in His will instead of going and joining the Philistines.
I'm like me, things that happened to me. A lot of times I didn't realize what God was doing until things happened and I look back, thinking about things, and I see God's footprints everywhere, doing all kinds of things to do things that I needed. And when I was going through it, didn't see it.
Right. It's not funny, I guess, but sad that we don't pay more attention. You know, because we live in this physical realm. And instead of doing what Jesus told us to do over and over and over, is pay attention to the spiritual realm. The real is the spiritual. Right? That's what really is going on. Okay.